Welcome back. Time for some Professor Delano. We're going to roll out to Washington, D.C. and bring the smartest man on the show onto the show. We've talked a lot about Cam Newton and the NFL. Let's take a break, talk a little politics or culture with Delano Squires. Professor D has written a column today, White Guilt More Destructive Than White Rage? Robin DiAngelo's new book unwittingly makes a persuasive case. Robin DiAngelo, of course, wrote the book White Fragility. She's a star. She's the white female version of Ibram X. Kendi, I think. She's a leader in the woke movement. Delano, explain your column today about how she perhaps unwittingly argued something that you actually believe in.
Sure. So in her new book, which is entitled Nice Racism, the subtitle of it actually is that, explaining how white progressives cause racial harm. And I thought about that over the weekend because every day I see new instances of, schools lowering standards of performance, getting rid of, testing mechanisms or, elite, as I said, standards of performance for, specialized high schools across the country. I see certain behaviors being excused, particularly within the African-American community, based on the notion of, well, certain people don't have the same types of resources, and there was redlining 60 years ago, so you have to expect certain things to go on. And after a while, honestly, I just got sick of it. And I got tired of hearing people, say that certain things should be acceptable in our community, and they not, accept those own things in their own homes or in their own community. So as I thought more about it, and I thought about how, the corporate media and basically every institution in this country is sold out to the notion that, white supremacy and white rage is the major threat to the homeland. And then I asked myself, which of these two things, white guilt or white rage, is more accepted in mainstream culture? Which of them is celebrated when they're seen, and which of them is, universally condemned? And it was clear to me that white guilt has a lot more room to operate. Jason, I'm sure you see every day there's some, TikTok video of some teacher talking some craziness to her students, and nobody seems to say anything about it. There are private schools in D.C. that have been totally overrun with Ibram Kendi style anti-racism, everything from the administration down to the classroom. And I just decided it was time to write about it. And specifically on a personal level, it offends me because people like Robin DiAngelo think that her opinion of me and my family and my neighborhood and my community is something that I should care about. So she has these sessions with, other guilty white folks, and they speak as if it is their behaviors and thoughts and values that will ultimately decide the future and the fate of Black America. And I reject that completely. And it offends me on a personal level. And that's why I decided to write the column.
As I was sitting there listening to you talk, Delano, I was thinking about my humble beginnings. And, my dad didn't graduate high school. My mother was a factory worker. I've lived at times in some real poverty. And, particularly when I was a young boy, and then when I was older, a senior in high school, I'm talking about real poverty. There's just me and my father in a one-bedroom, 400 square foot apartment. My father making $200 a week as a bartender for a friend. And there were no diminished standards for me in terms of what my father expected of me wasn't controlled by our conditions. Were we redlined into that one bedroom, 400 square foot apartment? Probably not. So it didn't matter how you end up in the hood in impoverished conditions, but what are the standards that you hold yourself to? And I know so many other people that started from nothing, but now they're here And it's like this entire generation is being taught that where you're allowed to buy a house and how much access you have to white people determines how much success you're gonna have. And it is offensive, and I could imagine as a black father and husband, 3 kids, that's gotta be offensive to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and the most ironic part of it is particularly the black folks who do this are the ones that claim to have, the highest sense of racial pride. These are the people, whether it's Hannah Nicole Jones or Ibram Kendi or Ta-Nehisi Coates or any number of activists and elected officials who look at a high school that's 95% black, and before they ask, what type of performance, the kids are, what level of performance the kids are at, what are some of the issues that they face maybe in their homes or in their neighborhoods, the first thing they say is, oh, this school is 95% black. It's segregated, and therefore it's less than. But for some reason, when a college campus is 95% black, right, and as an HBCU, then that is a culturally affirming education environment. So even though they claim to preach pro-blackness, in effect what they do is that they equate something that's all black to something that's negative. And that's just not something that I can get on board with. And they do it whether you're talking about communities, neighborhoods, schools. And as I said, I find it offensive. And really, again, part of the column was about, Robin DiAngelo and the types of obsessions of, guilty white liberals and the reason that they do some of these things. Because, really what it is, and I say this in the article, it's really a symbiotic relationship between white liberals who are seeking forgiveness for sins that they didn't commit and black liberals who are seeking affirmation for injustices that they didn't really endure. And that relationship is one in which they both feed off of the trauma and the negative environments and circumstances, oftentimes of the black poor. And we've talked about this before, right? That's how you see, an incident, whether it's George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, it starts out talking about police reform, and then next thing you know, it's about paying Robin DiAngelo $20,000 to give a speech at the University of Kentucky, and Ibram Kendi $40,000 to do some training seminar, in Loudoun County Public Schools. It always goes that way. And our country, and I said this in the article, we're stuck between a black rock and a white hard place, where these people have us on a path of tribal warfare, right? Because eventually, and I'm gonna be frank here, eventually some white folk are gonna stand up, get some steel in their spine, and they're gonna start walking out of these HR meetings and saying, I'm not putting up with this crap. I'm not gonna allow you to make me feel guilty for things that I didn't do. That's how I would react. There's no way that you would get me to sit in a seminar for an hour and to have me apologize for the actions of other people just because they look like me. So if a black guy sticks up a store, I'm not gonna come in and prostrate myself in front of some instructor and say, oh yes, I'm so sorry. No, all of us should be judged on the things that we do. We're not even responsible for the things that our parents do, let alone people who we don't know who just happen to, share our skin color. So as I said, I find it offensive, and particularly as it relates to Christians. I see that this Kendian-style anti-racism has crept its way into the church, into the American evangelical church, and it is tearing apart relationships, and it's going to tear apart churches. And the way I typically see it work is that white Christians take upon themselves a certain savior status, and they believe that it is their job to rescue black folk in general from the legacy of Jim Crow and slavery. And black Christians accept that position, that lowered status, right? Not as fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, but really as children who need to be rescued. And with their mouths, they say, I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me. But in the back of their minds, they say, but only if white people let me. And as I said, that type of thing is weakness. And weakness is always met with more aggression in the natural world. So I'm not for raising weak men in my house. I'm not for promoting that type of behavior. And that's why when I see it, I feel obligated to speak out, about it, because I really do think, our country has come a long way in the last, generation. And I see everyday instances of people trying to relate to one another as individuals, trying to work together in a sense of harmony and brotherhood. And you have these people, again, motivated by guilt on one hand and the desperate need for affirmation on the other, who are making everybody's lives much more difficult.
Delano, you had another, I thought, brilliant passage in your piece. If white guilt in the classroom threatens American minds, its counterpart on the streets threatens American lives. I thought that was great, and then your explanation afterwards, I thought, really hammered that point, if you don't mind explaining.
Sure. As I said, I started talking about, the way this works out in the classroom, right? So schools getting rid of, the mayor of Oregon, and I mentioned this in the piece, the governor, of Oregon, got rid of the literacy and numeracy standards that kids had to meet before they graduated. And she specifically said she was doing it in the name of, Black and Indigenous and Latino, students. So again, lowering standards in the name of equity. What we saw last year was a similar type of phenomenon as it related to standards of behavior and conduct in our cities all across the country. So when, there were protests, racial justice protests after, George Floyd was killed. And alongside with that, there were instances of looting and burning and violence. And the reaction from corporate media was some combination of, rioting is the language of the unheard. It was, property damage is not really violence. It was, well, who cares if these kids steal some things from Gucci, because that's really some form of reparations. And time and again, what you saw was elected officials, right? Oftentimes white mayors and white governors, who made excuses for certain behavior in our communities that they would never allow in their own. And the reason I know that is because some of them, and I'm thinking particularly of the mayor of Seattle, where she allowed, anarchists and radicals to take over, a six square block portion of a city. And she made light of it until those protesters came to her house. Then she shut the whole thing down. And in the span of time that Chaz was up and operating, there were 2 young Black men who lost their lives. So again, I mentioned Mayor Bill de Blasio, who I just think is completely incompetent and has wrecked New York City in many different ways. He has a program now where he wants to pay people who've engaged in criminal behavior to not do so. Earlier in his tenure, he gave criminals cell phones and tickets to Mets games. And it's always about lowering standards when it comes to Black folk in the name of equity. And when that happens, when they criticize the police and the police pull back and become, more conservative, small c in terms of crime prevention, the people who always end up losing their lives are Black folk. And I've said this before, 96% of New York's homicide victims last year were either Black and Hispanic. So the latte liberals and the Chardonnay Antifa folks talk a good game from the safety of their homes, but when it comes to the people whose bodies are dropping, it's always the ones in our community.
Delano, great job. I got an assignment for you the rest of the week. If you haven't already made up your mind what you're going to write and talk about next time. But I saw you yesterday tweet out something I found fascinating, and I responded to it as well. The United Teachers Association LA president, Cicely Myers Cruz, says learning loss is a myth. She was quoted directly, "It's okay that our babies may not have learned all their times tables. They know the difference between a riot and a protest. They know the words insurrection and coup." I can't wait to hear your take on that. If you don't write about it, we're certainly going to talk about it.
Okay.
But thank you so much. Great job as always.
If I said it, I meant it. Bite my tongue for no